Hey, fourth grade, ready for Chapter 12 of Aurora County All-Stars. Chapter 11 left us with quite a cliffhanger. Let's see if any of our questions from the last chapter are answered in this chapter. All right, here we go. Chapter 12 starts with a quote by Jackie Robinson, the second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Life is not a spectator sport. If you're going to spend your whole life in the grandstand just watching what goes on, in my opinion, you're wasting your life. House opened his eyes. It was mud dark, the time just before full dark, when the heat of the day fizzed its last and gave way to the cooler velvet summer night. He lay on his bed in the sleeping porch and listened to the leftover raindrops drip from the pine needles onto the dirt yard. He looked at the clock by the bed. He had slept right through the storm, right through dinner, right through Honey's bedtime. Soon his father would go to bed as well. He stared at the ceiling, at the lines and cracks in the plaster. His heart beat, a steady, strong beat, and it took him a while to come back to himself. He breathed in and out, just as Mr. Norwood Boyd had done that very morning, just before daylight. Just as his mother had done 6 years ago. Just as he would do one day. His father had said, "That day's a long way off, House. You don't need to worry about that." But sometimes he did. He didn't need a light to find what he wanted. As the moon was rising early after the rain, the baseball mitt his mother had given him when he was 6 was on the top shelf in his closet. There. He folded it open, shut, open. He poked his hand into its cool cavern, but of course it no longer fit his hand. The smell of neat's foot oil lingered in the creases. The ball was gone. He couldn't remember why it was gone, or if it had indeed said Elizabeth. Maybe that was just his dream. He heard a familiar click and looked down the hall. His father had switched on his reading light. On House's door was taped a note in his father's handwriting. Klebo called. No practice. Team meets 8 a.m. at the Hallelujah ball field. Leftovers in the fridge. It was time. House left the sleeping porch, careful not to let the screen door slap. The warm night air was damp and alive with the racket of katydids, crickets, and frogs. The moon was a bone-white circle. House made his way out to the dirt road, where he walked the half-mile to Mr. Norwood Boyd's home. The gate was still open. House went right to the honeysuckle bush beside the front porch. He crawled inside. The wet branches slicked him with leftover rain. There she was, a little whine, a little lick, a little snuffle. House patted Eudora. Good dog. He removed the tutu from around her neck and hung it on an inside branch. Honey loves you, he said. You can get used to her, you know. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the note that Eudora Welty had worn around her neck only that morning. When he first read it, he had been stunned. His mother was here, in this note. Moonlight sifted through the honeysuckle branches as House read for the 100th time the words written with a fountain pen in Norwood Boyd's old-school, perfect handwriting. After the dazzle of day is gone, only the dark, dark night shows to my eyes the stars. After the clangor of organ majestic, or chorus, or perfect band, silent athwart my soul, moves the symphony true. By Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. His hands shook. There they were, those words of his mother's, her song, the song she had sung so many times, the symphony song. They were written by someone named Walt Whitman. He thought his mother had made them up. He had forgotten most of the words. It was hard, after all, for a 6-year-old to remember or even know what clangor meant. What was athwart? But symphony true? He had remembered that. After the dazzle of days gone, he remembered that. And the dark, dark night, like now, dark, dark night with a brilliant moon rising. Mr. Norwood Boyd had written more. From the library doorway, 5 bookcases to the right, 7th shelf up, the only green spine. He had penned 3 more lines. Your mother gave these words to me. Now I give them to you, as treasure for the days ahead. Look for me in every atom that you see. House swallowed. None of the words on the page spoke more loudly to him than the knowledge that they conveyed. His mother had known Norwood Boyd. He's an old friend of the family, his father had said. A little peculiar, but nothing to worry about, Keith said. But this note said more. Elizabeth Jackson had known Norwood Boyd very well. He shoved the note back into his pocket and stroked Eudora Welty. Want to go inside, girl? He led Eudora out of the honeysuckle, and together they went around to the back porch, to the door that opened into the summer kitchen, which was a large room with a 6-burner stove, a deep enamel sink, and a long wooden table. Ages ago, someone canned tomatoes and green beans in this room. Ages ago, children took baths in here with water that had been heated on the stove and poured into tin tubs sitting on the old wood floor. Maybe one of those children had been Mr. Norwood Boyd, long, long ago. The summer kitchen hadn't been used in years, much like the rest of the house. Cobwebs drifted from the rafters, and the windows were covered in dust. House had never been inside Mr. Norwood Boyd's house alone, or at night. It was creepy. He hadn't thought to bring a flashlight, but he knew there was one in Mr. Norwood Boyd's bedroom. He would have to brave the summer kitchen, the dining room, and the wide hallway to get to the front bedroom where Mr. Norwood Boyd had spent most of his time. The library was across the hall from the bedroom. That would be his final destination. Eudora headed straight for her food and water and began to slurp and crunch. The sounds were comforting, normal. House took a breath, took a step, took another. He tiptoed through the rooms as if there were someone still in the house, as if every atom were alive and watching him. Down the long, wide hallway he crept until he found himself in front of the door to Mr. Norwood Boyd's bedroom. It was closed. Now that he was faced with turning the knob and walking into the room where Mr. Norwood had died, he couldn't bring himself to go in. He could see well enough in the moonlit dark, he told himself, so he turned around and faced the library door. It, too, was closed. House put his hand on the library doorknob, nervous, at another closed door. How many times had he been in this room, finding the next book on Mr. Norwood Boyd's list to be read aloud? And now there was something waiting for him in the library, a treasure. As he gripped the doorknob and began to turn it, he heard a click behind him from Mr. Norwood Boyd's bedroom door. Then the squeak of the door as it swung wide. He whirled. A flashlight beam struck him in the eyes and blinded him. He stumbled backward into a narrow table against the hallway wall. A scream gargled in his throat as a hand clapped itself over his mouth. Someone else's hand. A cold hand. A ghost. That's the end of chapter 12. Oh my goodness. So many questions and another cliffhanger. Deborah Wiles does it again. We're left with so many questions at the end of that chapter. Whose hand is on his mouth? Someone's in the house. Oh, I have so many questions. Is it Mr. Norwood Boyd and somehow he's not really dead? Is it someone else? actually a ghost? Gosh, we are going to be waiting in suspense until tomorrow. I can already hear all your voices going, no, read one more chapter. Tomorrow. I want you to think about that. What is going on at the end of this chapter? Who's in the house? What's going to happen? Is house going to be okay? So many questions. See you next time.